At the will reading, my billionaire grandfather left everyone millions of dollars. I only got $50. My dad smiled while my brother laughed. I said nothing, staring at the money he left me. He had quietly marked something on it. At the bank, the manager looked at me and froze. The silence in the office turned sharp and brittle. My fingers traced a microscopic, jagged ink stain near the serial number. This was not a mistake. The manager's face drained of all color as he locked the door. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut with a finality that made my pulse jump. Mr. Thompson did not look at my face anymore. He stared only at the $50 bills resting on his blotter. His hands trembled as he pulled a specialized ultraviolet lens from his desk drawer. Outside in the lobby, the muffled sound of distant footsteps felt 1,000 miles away. He leaned forward until his forehead almost touched the paper. A low, electronic hum filled the small room. He looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying respect. I remembered the way Grandpa Will used to tap his fountain pen against his thumb. He always told me that the loudest men in the room were usually the emptiest. My father and Ethan were currently at a steakhouse, celebrating their new fortunes while I sat in this cold chair. They thought I was a failure because I stayed quiet. They never noticed how Grandpa watched me during those long, silent afternoons. Thompson slid a thick, black leather folder toward me. It was bound in heavy silver chains. The weight of the folder was unexpected. It felt like cold lead in my lap. Thompson punched a sequence into a keypad hidden beneath his desk. A section of the wall groaned and slid backward, revealing a narrow, sterile corridor lined with steel. He didn't ask for my ID or my signature. The 2 marked bills were the only identification he required. We walked into the cool air of the private vault. My breath hitched. This was a place meant for secrets. The shadows here felt thick and intentional. Row after row of safe deposit boxes gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Thompson stopped at a box that had no number, only a small engraving of a fountain pen. He inserted a master key and stepped back, bowing his head slightly. I reached out, my skin prickling with a strange electricity. Inside lay stacks of documents and a single, cream-colored envelope with my name. I realized then that the millions given to my family were just a distraction. This small box held the true heart of his empire. I opened the letter and recognized the sharp, elegant script immediately. My grandfather had planned this theater for years. He knew the greed of his sons would blind them to the real prize. The trust described in these pages was worth 10 times their combined inheritances. It gave me total control over the family land and the company board. I looked at the manager, who was waiting for my first command. My father and brother were about to discover exactly why I was always the quiet one. I gripped the letter as the vault door hummed. The cool air tasted of ozone and old paper. Mr. Thompson remained a silent statue by the wall. I needed to move fast before my father started asking questions. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a sharp, aggressive buzz. It was a message from Ethan. He was already demanding a celebratory dinner at my expense. He still thought I was the family charity case. Little did he know. The documents in the box were bound in deep blue silk. I scanned the first page and felt a chill. This was a dead man's switch. Trust. It contained the titles to the family's primary estates and offshore holdings. Grandpa had bypassed every legal safeguard my father built. My primary objective was to sign the acceptance before the board met at noon. If I missed that window, the assets would revert to the public will. Time was bleeding out. We must go now, I whispered, tucking the folder under my arm. Thompson nodded and led me through a back exit. The alleyway was damp and smelled of rain. A black sedan waited at the curb with the engine idling. I stepped inside and saw a man in a gray suit. He didn't say a word. He simply handed me a fountain pen. It was the same gold pen Grandpa used for every major deal. My hand shook. As we moved through traffic, the pressure began to mount. My father's assistant called twice. They were already at the corporate headquarters. They likely intended to vote on a merger that would liquidate Grandpa's legacy. I had 30 minutes to reach the top floor. The driver swerved around a delivery truck with practiced ease. I opened the folder to find the final signature page. There was a small, red wax seal at the bottom. It looked like blood. The car screeched to a halt in front of the glass tower. I pushed through the revolving doors and headed for the private lift. The lobby guard stepped into my path with a frown. "This floor is restricted today. Miss Lillian," he said. I didn't argue or plead for entry. I simply held up the bills. He looked at the marks and stepped aside instantly. His radio crackled with a frantic, confused warning from the penthouse. I reached the top floor just as the double doors opened. The boardroom was a sea of expensive wool and cold stares. My father stood at the head of the table, holding a gavel. Ethan was leaning back, checking his reflection in a silver spoon. They both looked up as I walked in. The air in the room vanished. "Lillian, you don't belong here," my father snapped. I didn't leave. I walked straight to the empty chairman's chair. I placed the blue folder on the polished wood. The board members exchanged worried glances. My father reached for the documents, but I pinned them down. "The quiet child is finished," I said. I turned the folder toward the lead attorney. He gasped as he saw the red seal and the RFID bills. Ethan's smirk vanished into a mask of pure terror. My father's gavel fell to the floor. Under the table. I noticed his hand was bleeding. The lead attorney's hands shook as he inspected the red wax. My father tried to snatch the papers, but the security team stepped forward. They weren't his men anymore. The shift in the room was physical, a heavy pressure that made Ethan stop breathing. I sat in the velvet chair and let the silence grow. It was my weapon now. The attorney cleared his throat and looked at my father with pity. "Richard, you need to sit down. This is a mistake," my father hissed. His face a shade of bruised purple. He clutched his bleeding hand, the red staining his white cuff. I didn't blink. I pulled the two $50 bills from my pocket and laid them flat. Under the bright boardroom lights, the invisible marks glowed like tiny embers. They were the matching halves of a digital key. The attorney tapped a tablet, and a holographic ledger projected onto the table. Everything was gone. The board members stared at the glowing numbers in disbelief. Grandpa had moved the liquid capital into a restricted vault years ago. My father had been spending a ghost fortune for months. He looked at the screen, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Ethan finally found his voice, but it was high and thin. "That's our money, Lillian. You can't just take it." I smiled for the first time. It felt like cold iron. "I am not taking anything, Ethan," I said quietly. "I am simply following the instructions of the majority shareholder." The attorney nodded, confirming my status. I had the power to dissolve the current board by sunset. The men around the table began to lean away from my father. They were survivors, and they knew the wind had changed. My father sank into his seat, his bravado finally crumbling. He looked small. He looked like a stranger. Suddenly, a side door burst open and two federal agents entered. The room froze. They didn't look at me or the board. They walked straight to my brother. Ethan turned a sickly shade of gray and tried to stand. "Ethan Carter, you are under arrest for securities fraud," the lead agent said. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't called them. I looked at the folder. Grandpa had timed this. He knew about the debt. Ethan was handcuffed before he could even offer a bribe. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, begging for help. I looked away. My father was silent, watching his golden son being led out in shame. The legacy was burning. And I was the one holding the matches. The board members were whispering now, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. I stood up and straightened my jacket. The air felt much thinner. The lead agent stopped at the door and looked back at me. He held up a small, black thumb drive he had taken from Ethan's pocket. "We found the missing ledger, Miss Carter," he said. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Ethan hadn't just been gambling with his own money. He had been using my name to sign the illegal contracts. I wasn't just the heir. I was the primary suspect in a federal crime. The agent's words echoed against the glass walls. My father's eyes snapped toward me, a predatory gleam replacing his despair. He saw a chance to survive by burying me. I pulled the gold pen from my pocket, my knuckles white. My objective was clear. I had to prove the signatures were forgeries before they took me. The room felt smaller as the second agent moved toward my chair. I needed a miracle in 10 minutes. "Check the dates on those contracts," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The lead agent paused and plugged the drive into the boardroom console. A list of digital timestamps filled the screen in bright green text. My father stood up, his hand still dripping red onto the carpet. "She was always the quiet one, plotting in the shadows," he lied. I looked at the screen and realized the signatures were dated during my college finals. I had been 500 miles away on those specific days. The attorney leaned in, his brow furrowed as he scanned the logs. "These were signed from a terminal inside this building," he noted. My father's face went pale. The mid-scene turn was sharp and cold. I pointed to the login ID associated with the files. It wasn't mine or Ethan's. It was a guest account used exclusively by my father's personal secretary. He had framed us both. The betrayal hung in the air like thick smoke. My father tried to back away, but the security team blocked the exit. He had sacrificed his own son to cover his tracks. The agents exchanged a look and redirected their focus. The pressure shifted instantly from my chest to his. I watched him crumble as the evidence linked his private bank accounts to the fraud. He looked at me, pleading for a mercy he never gave. "You knew," he rasped, his voice cracking. I didn't answer him. I simply opened the blue silk folder again and pulled out the final document. It was a recorded confession from his secretary, dated the day Grandpa died. She had been loyal to the old man, not the son. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a curated cage for the monsters in our family. The trap was finally shut. The agents moved in, their silver handcuffs clicking with a rhythmic, metallic precision. My father didn't fight. He went limp as they led him past the board members who had once bowed to him. The room was deathly quiet now. I was the last Carter standing in a room full of ghosts. I looked at the gold pen in my hand and felt a hollow ache. I had won the empire but lost the family. I turned to Thompson, who stood by the window. He looked older in the midday sun. "Is it over?" I asked. He didn't smile. He pointed toward the holographic screen, where a new notification was blinking in urgent yellow. Someone had just initiated a mass sell off of the company's stock from an external source. I checked the IP address and felt my blood turn to ice. My mother was the one holding the final detonator. The stock ticker on the wall bled red as the numbers plummeted. My mother was the one person no one ever suspected. She had played the grieving widow with such perfection that even Grandpa's shadows missed her. My objective was to lock the trading floor before the firm hit zero. I grabbed the desk phone and dialed the security exchange directly. The board members were shouting now, their greed replaced by a frantic, high-pitched panic. The entire empire was dissolving in a digital fire. "Lillian. She is liquidating the primary trust," Thompson warned, his eyes glued to the terminal. I realized the $50 bills were only half of the solution. To stop a mass sell-off, I needed the physical override key kept in the penthouse safe. I sprinted toward the private stairs, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The pressure was a physical weight on my chest. If I failed now, the legacy would be worthless. My mother was burning the house down to hide the ashes. I reached the top floor and found the safe door already standing wide open. My mother sat in Grandpa's old wingback chair, holding a glass of amber liquid. She didn't look like a victim anymore. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and entirely focused on the laptop in her lap. "He always loved you best because you were quiet," she said softly. I saw the override key plugged into her computer. The power balance shifted as she hovered her finger over the final delete key. "Mother, stop this right now," I commanded, my voice echoing in the marble hall. She laughed, a dry sound that had no humor in it. She revealed that Grandpa had planned to divorce her before he died. The millions he left her in the public will were a settlement to keep her silent about the fraud. She didn't want the money. She wanted to destroy the man who tried to cast her aside. I stepped closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He didn't cast you aside. He protected you from the law," I countered, sliding the blue folder toward her. I showed her the clause that shielded her from my father's crimes. She paused, her gaze flickering to the legal text. For a moment, the room felt balanced on the edge of a knife. The sell-off slowed as she processed the truth. She realized her scorched earth policy would actually trigger the investigation she feared most. She pulled the key out. The ticker on the wall stabilized, the red lines finally leveling off into a bruised purple. I took a deep breath, feeling the room stop spinning. The immediate crisis was over, but the air remained thick with betrayal. My mother closed the laptop and stood up, smoothing her black dress. She looked at me with a strange, fleeting respect before walking toward the balcony. She had lost her leverage, but she still held the family secrets. We were finally alone in the wreckage. I walked over to the desk to secure the override key. My hands were finally steady as I reached for the silver device. I noticed a small, hidden compartment in the back of the safe that my mother had overlooked. Inside was a second envelope, identical to the one Thompson gave me, but addressed to the bank manager. I tore it open and found a single photograph of a child I didn't recognize. The back of the photo was dated for next year. Grandpa was not just predicting, he was planning our timeline from beyond the grave. I stared at the photograph until the child's eyes seemed to blink in the dim light. The dated caption on the back felt like a curse from the grave. Grandpa had anticipated a birth that had not happened yet. My mother watched me from the balcony edge, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline. I needed to know if this child was a threat to the trust's legal structure. My objective shifted to securing the child's identity before my mother could regain her composure. The air grew colder. "Who is this girl, Mother?" I asked, holding the photo up like a shield. She turned slowly, her face a mask of sudden, genuine terror. She didn't look at me. She looked at the envelope in my shaking hand. The pressure in the room spiked as she realized I had found the one secret she kept hidden even from my father. She took a step back toward the railing, her heels clicking on the cold marble. She looked ready to jump. I stayed still. I didn't want a tragedy. "That is the reason your grandfather stayed in this marriage," she whispered. Her voice was thin and brittle like dry leaves. She explained that the girl was not mine or Ethan's. She was the product of a secret surrogate, a biological backup for the family legacy. Grandpa had been grooming a new heir in total darkness. The power balance shattered as I realized my position was merely a temporary shield for this unknown child. I was just a placeholder. The trust documents in my folder began to feel heavy. I looked at the blue folder again and saw a hidden seal I had previously ignored. It was a secondary activation code that only triggered upon the child's legal birth. Grandpa had used me to clear the board of my father and Ethan. I was the cleaner, meant to sanitize the empire for a perfect successor. My mother laughed, a jagged sound that cut through the silence. She had been trying to burn the company to prevent this girl from ever taking over. We were both pawns. We are just the guardians of a ghost, I said. Lie? My voice finally hardening. I walked toward the laptop and reinserted the override key. If Grandpa wanted a puppet, he had picked the wrong granddaughter. My new objective was to rewrite the trust's final distribution before the birth certificate could be filed. The obstacle was the bank's internal clock, which was synchronized to the sunset. I had 10 minutes to bypass the primary encryption. Thompson watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. He knew the child was coming. The encryption was a series of chess moves based on Grandpa's favorite games. I typed frantically, my fingers flying across the keys. My mother moved closer, but she didn't stop me this time. She wanted the cycle to end as much as I did. We were finally on the same side of the war. A red progress bar crawled across the screen, mocking my speed. Thompson stepped into the room and placed a heavy, brass key on the table. It was the physical override. He chose me. He told me to give you this only if you figured it out, Thompson said. I didn't waste time with thanks. I turned the key and the red bar turned a brilliant, solid green. The trust was now locked under my sole discretion, the backup heir's claim permanently severed. I felt a surge of relief that tasted like iron. The empire was truly mine now. My mother sat down on the floor and covered her face. The battle for the penthouse was over. The silence returned. I walked to the balcony and looked out at the sprawling city. The lights were flickering on, one by one, like distant stars. The child in the photo would be born into a world of comfort, but not a world of power. I would ensure she was safe, but she would never be a weapon. I had broken the chain that Grandpa had spent decades forging. The $50 in my pocket felt like a distant memory from another life. I was a different woman now. I was free. I turned back to the room and saw Thompson holding a second, smaller phone. It was ringing with a private, encrypted tone. He answered it, listened for a few seconds, and then looked at me with a grim expression. There has been a complication at the clinic, he said. My heart stopped. The child wasn't just a plan for the future. The surrogate was in labor right now. The date on the photo was wrong. Grandpa had lied about the timing to keep me focused on the board. The news of the labor hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa had played his final card with brutal mathematical precision. I needed to reach that clinic before the birth was recorded in the digital ledger. If the name was entered under his old protocol, my new encryption would fail instantly. I grabbed my coat and moved toward the private elevator. My mother remained on the floor, her spirit broken by the revelation. Thompson followed me, his phone still pressed tightly to his ear. The hunt was on. We sprinted through the lobby as rain began to lash against the glass. The city felt like a vast, dark labyrinth designed to slow me down. Traffic was a solid wall of red lights and wet asphalt. I looked at the GPS and saw the clinic was 5 miles uptown. The driver navigated the sedan onto the shoulder, the siren hidden behind the grill wailing. Every second felt like a year. I clutched the gold pen until my palm bled. I was fighting a ghost child. The clinic was a nondescript building made of limestone and tinted windows. It looked more like a fortress than a hospital. 2 security guards stood at the entrance, their hands resting on their holsters. They didn't move as we approached the heavy doors. I showed them the bills, but they didn't flinch this time. Grandpa had given them a different set of orders. These men were paid to keep everyone out until the first cry was heard. The obstacle was finally physical and dangerous. "Move aside," I said, my voice cold and steady. The lead guard shook his head, his eyes fixed on a point behind me. Thompson stepped forward and produced a small, black remote from his pocket. He pressed a button, and the building's power grid hummed, and then died. The security locks clicked open as the emergency lights flickered on in a sickly shade of red. The power balance shifted in a heartbeat. The guards looked at their useless scanners. We pushed past them into the dim, pulsing hallway. The air inside smelled of antiseptic and ozone. I followed the sound of rhythmic beeping coming from the end of the corridor. My objective was the nurse's station, where the birth records were being processed. I saw a woman sitting behind a glass partition, her fingers hovering over a keyboard. She looked up, her face pale in the red light. I realized she wasn't a nurse. She was a lawyer from my father's old firm. The corruption ran deeper than I ever imagined. "You are too late, Lillian," the lawyer said with a thin, triumphant smile. She pointed to the monitor, where the birth data was already being uploaded to the cloud. I felt a surge of cold fury. I didn't argue with her. I used the gold pen to shatter the glass partition with a single, sharp strike. The shards rained down like diamonds on her desk. I reached through the opening and ripped the Ethernet cable from the wall. The upload bar on the screen froze at 90%. The room went silent as the lawyer stared at the severed wire. I had stopped the transmission, but the data was still sitting on the local drive. I needed to delete the record manually before the backup power kicked in. I jumped through the broken window and pushed her aside. My fingers flew across the keys, searching for the specific file name. I found it tucked under a subdirectory labeled with Grandpa's initials. I hit the delete key and held it down. The file vanished. A sudden, sharp cry echoed from the room next door. The child had arrived. I sat back, my chest heaving as the emergency lights finally turned back to a steady, warm white. The lawyer slumped against the wall, knowing her leverage was gone. I had won the digital war, but the human reality was now breathing in the next room. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my stomach. The secret heir was no longer a plan. She was a living person. I walked slowly toward the delivery room door. The handle felt cold in my hand. I expected to see a team of doctors, but the room was empty except for a young woman and a small bundle. The surrogate looked exhausted. Her hair matted with sweat. She looked at me with a mix of fear and confusion. I realized Grandpa hadn't just brought a legacy, he had bought a person's life. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the girl. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers. She didn't look like a threat or a weapon. She just looked small. I reached out and let her grab my pinky finger. In that moment, the empire didn't matter. Promised her she would never know the coldness of our family's boardrooms. I looked at the door and saw Thompson standing there with a new set of papers. He looked down at the floor. The surrogate wasn't part of the contract anymore. I stood by the hospital bed, watching the infant's chest rise. The surrogate woman, Alina, clutched the thin sheets with white knuckles. My objective was simple. I had to get them out of this clinical prison before the lawyers returned with the police. Thompson handed me a heavy, brass key that felt cold in my palm. The hallway echoed with the heavy thud of boots. My father's legal team was not done yet. They were coming for the final asset. "Can you walk?" I asked, my voice low and urgent. Elena nodded, though her face was a mask of sheer exhaustion. She knew this was her only chance at freedom. I wrapped the baby in a soft, wool blanket from the chair. We moved toward the service elevator, dodging the red emergency lights. The pressure was a physical weight on my neck. If we were caught, the trust would be frozen for decades. My father would win from behind his bars. We reached the basement level just as the lift groaned. The garage was a cavern of concrete and exhaust fumes. I saw a dark SUV waiting near the exit with the lights off. Thompson stayed behind to block the elevator sensors. He gave me a sharp nod, his eyes full of a strange, final loyalty. I realized he was sacrificing his career for this moment. We scrambled into the back seat of the car. The driver hit the gas before the doors even closed. We were moving, but we weren't safe. As we cleared the city limits, I pulled the 2 bills from my pocket and looked at the marks under the car's dim light. The ink seemed to shift, revealing a hidden set of numbers I had missed before. It was a phone number for a law firm in Switzerland. My grandfather had built a second layer of protection outside of the American courts. The power balance shifted again. I wasn't just hiding, I was moving the entire game. "We are going to a safe house," I told Elena. She looked out the window at the blurred trees, silent and wary. I felt the gold pen in my pocket, a reminder of the blood already spilled. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken truths. I realized that my grandfather had never intended for me to run the company. He wanted me to burn it down. He left me the tools to destroy the family name forever. I felt a grim satisfaction. The car stopped at a secluded gate made of black iron. A man in a dark coat stepped forward, checking our faces with a high-intensity lamp. I handed him the $50 bills through the window. He didn't look at the money. He looked at the serial numbers. He tapped his headset and the gate swung open with a heavy, metallic groan. We drove inside, but the driver didn't stop at the house. He headed for the private airstrip. Grandfather's pilot was waiting.